Okay, today we're going to take a look at the civil rights movement. Now, keep in mind, this is the civil rights movement of the 1950s, not the 1960s. Okay, so this is the build-up period, not the actual end result. All right, so starting off, let's break down first of all the origins of the movement. At the federal level, we started to see a lot of changes. One, Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier. He's signed by the Dodgers and becomes the first black baseball player to play with the white teams. So we have integration. We also saw that President Truman, back during the end of World War II, went ahead and integrated the armed forces, and it began with the Army and the Navy. However, though the South, remember, is still remaining adamant about preventing equal rights for African Americans. We have poll taxes. In other words, if you went to vote, you had to pay money. Most African Americans couldn't afford to do that. You had Jim Crow laws where you had to take a literacy test if you were black, or you would have to, answer crazy, insane types of tests to show your knowledge of political science, and just straight up segregation, literally through Plessy versus Ferguson. As long as you had an equal facility for African Americans, there was really nothing the African Americans could do down in the South because the whites controlled the government. Now, one of the things that really started to make a big change too is the 1940s and 1950s. We have such a large shift in movement. You can see here on the chart, in the 1920s we had the huge exodus after World War One, and again this reoccurs after World War Two in the 40s and the 50s. And this is again because economic opportunities were starting to boom, particularly up in the north as everybody started working again after the Great Depression. And so a number of African Americans started moving towards urban settings, getting away from the rural areas, and were no longer sharecropping or tenant farming. The other big shift, though, that makes this change is African Americans finally realized that, being a member of the Republican Party was ridiculous. Republicans weren't really doing anything for them. And the shift to the Democrats is really what's going to cause the political activization of the African American. The other problem was too, you started to see this attitude change. There's a fear of communism in the 1950s, and the idea if America is supposed to represent freedom and communism is anti-freedom, this idea that the black man could actually turn towards communism. And you can see here from this poster from the Communist Party, this was a real issue. You can see that they were trying to win votes for the American Communist Party, and they actually ran a black man as vice president, hoping to draw in, where communism, of course, technically everybody is equal. So, this was a real fear, and, people started to realize that if we claim to be a free country, then we need to treat everybody equally. And so this attitude, particularly in the North and out in the West, really began to shift some. Now, the big one, of course, is the desegregation of schools. Brown, she wanted to attend a white school because they had better facilities and better teachers. And what happened was you had the case was handled by the NAACP, which was led by Thurgood Marshall. This is a picture of Thurgood Marshall on the left, who, of course, was a lawyer at the time and will later go on to be a Supreme Court justice. Marshall argued that segregation was illegal under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. In other words, all the rights of the Bill of Rights and our amendments are guaranteed equally to everyone. And for the southern states to arbitrarily say that people can be segregated was not protecting them under the 14th Amendment. Chief Justice Earl Warren and the court ruled that that was the case. Warren personally wrote up the findings of the court case. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the separate but equal. But the more famous quote from Warren was that segregation was inherently unequal by definition, and he urged that the schools be segregated with all due speed. Now, Problem was, when this came out, there was a lot of resistance. One, we had what was called the Southern Manifesto, in which 101 congressmen in the federal government actually signed this and saying that Warren had abused his power, overstepped his bounds, and was violating state sovereignty. Their manifesto just really was more of an outcry. It didn't have any real teeth to it. However, at the state level, we start to see the Ku Klux Klan starts making a huge comeback and starts growing and getting more powerful in the 50s and the 1960s. The culmination of the violation of this was Governor Orville Faubus, pictured here. He was the governor of Arkansas, literally called out the National Guard to prevent African American students from going into Little Rock High School. Eisenhower, who really was focused more on international policy than home policy, actually realized he had a duty to actually uphold the federal Constitution. And he actually dispatched the military and sent them to actually help the students. Now, once all this was said and done, you're still looking, guys, at a very small percentage of African Americans. By the 1960s, really, we only have about 2% of the schools were actually segregated, or desegregated, excuse me. Now, finally, we get, of course, the infamous Montgomery bus boycott. 1955, Rosa Parks, pictured here on the right, refused to give up her seat to a white man. And, of course, she was arrested for it, but this caused a massive outbreak. We get the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. appears on the scene and quickly organizes the boycott of the Montgomery busing system, which was really effective, and it actually brought national attention to the movement. And this really becomes the catalyst that will actually spark the civil rights movement. People finally taking notice and standing up for everything. Martin Luther King later organizes what was called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and this was the idea to call on churches throughout the South to actually stand up for desegregation. And this organization actually helped to organize a lot of protests. One of the big protests, which is pictured here on the right, was what was called the Greensboro Sit-In. These four African Americans sat down at the Woolworths counter, which was supposed to be a segregated area, and they would not move until forcibly removed. And the idea here was to peaceably disrupt businesses. And this will catch on. This ends up leading to the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They take over and they begin to start organizing on all levels. Sit-ins literally everywhere throughout the South. They do every venue from movie theaters to restaurants to parking lots, you name it. The only problem with this was progress was incredibly slow. And eventually this will give rise to more violent movements like the Black Panthers and cries from Malcolm X with the Nation of Islam.